Hello, my good friends. Mr. E here, today reporting live on the scene for Sloptide News Network because today we are in the field. We are going to be testing the practical applications of hotfix 1.11.6, which just dropped to Darktide earlier this morning. This one brings all of the patch changes that they talked about in the dev blog before the weekend. So we are seeing that big uncanny nerf. We're seeing the massive reduction in crushers and lots of other stuff, and hopefully there is a lot more to come, and it is not we're not waiting too overly long for it to drop, because if this is sort of what we're going to do now, we need to start to step up the pace and get this thing back into balance, as I'll talk about in a second. But before all that, I had to say thank you for tuning in, and of course, if you want to help support independent games journalism, such as this channel, well then you can subscribe to the channel, or maybe even become a member. Thanks for supporting. Okay, let's start with some basic stuff. The very first thing, which we'll talk about today, which is the balance changes, the enemy balance changes, hopefully the first of many for the game, the reduction in Ogryn Crushers, minus 35% on normal games-ish, they say roughly in there, and that applies to ambient spawns, horde spawns, and event spawns. So yeah, anytime there's a fourth spawn of Crushers or whatever, it's going to cut 1/3 of them out. And then Havoc, they cut an additional 15%. So this seems like you're going to have almost no Crushers, Bulwarks, and Reapers in Havoc. But remember that in Havoc, especially like Havoc 40, which this is where a lot of players tend to take the game very seriously, on Havoc 40, you have a doubling of Ogryns by default, and you have a doubling of Elites. So there's a massive, massive representation of Ogryns as compared to the normal game in Havoc already, and this is going to reduce that by 15%, which ultimately isn't a whole lot. There was just a ton. And what this is ultimately going to do for the game, at least in the short term, is it's going to provide more opportunity for low-end, I don't want to say low-end, but for weapons that were unequipped to deal with the Carapace threat to actually participate in the game. And this is something that was very visible in the early weeks of Hivescum when Pickpocket was unnerfed. And if you had an enemy composition, perhaps the seed of the map was very favorable and it didn't spawn that many Crushers on you, you could run rampant with a auto gun build and just go daka 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 the entire map, and it was super fun. But if you happened to roll into a map that decided to spawn a bunch of Crushers, you couldn't play the game. You fundamentally could not even participate. And that is the thing that they really, thankfully, have seen that was an issue here. We have one singular enemy, the Ogryn Crusher, that is cucking a big percentage of all the builds in the game, because there's a ton of weapons that are unequipped to deal with them. And so the only way that you could really realistically build your character to play these high levels of difficulty, especially into Havoc, is to have at least one thing in your kit that could counter the Crushers. So veterans were always running crack grenades, dueling swords were prevalent, the whatever range weapon you were running, or you had to either have one melee or one range that would be devoted to killing Crushers, and it might be specifically just to kill the Crushers, which is insane that one enemy out of all the enemies in the game can dictate the meta in that strong a way. So reducing him is a great first step. However, what I'll say is about the immediate sort of realistic application of this in the game just got a whole lot easier with this change. Because yes, we did have a nerf to Uncanny Strike, as I'll get to in a second, but they just removed a big percentage of one of the most difficult enemies in the game. And there was almost no other nerfs in this patch to player power, which is the reason why we have this many elites and stuff and heavy hitters in the game to begin with. So with that, with less Crushers, the difficulty went way down, reducing the effectiveness, or kind of nerfing Uncanny Strike. Certainly that will impact people who were using Dueling Sword, but there's a tons of builds that weren't using it, and those builds are just fine. So we're gonna see just a much easier game, I feel like, in the immediate aftermath of this. My hope is that they come back in and they can start to take away some other really OP stuff and get us all down to a lower level. Like I've been saying for the longest time, nuclear disarmament is sort of my goal for Darktide. I would like to return to a simpler state where everything isn't just like 50 million explosions, where the standard for what is a good weapon isn't measured in kills per second, but is instead measures in seconds per kill, right? And I think that the Uncanny Strike change is a good step in the first the first step in that direction, but we still have way more problematic things than what the dueling sword was, most of which are not in the melee category, most of which are blitzes and ultimates and range weapons. But we'll talk about those in a later date. Let's go on to the class balance changes here. Ogren got a little surprise buff here with an increase to his little jumping height. Now, he can still get stuck kind of uncommonly. I played around with him for a little bit. Pretty comfortable to vault now. Basically, it felt like he had kind of like a rounded toes before, where you would be definitely climbing on something for any other class, but he would just kind of roll off of it. And now it seems like he's much more sticky. He can very easily grab onto these ledges. There are still some weird railings that a lot of classes have problems mantling. I find that he can't quite get on properly, but it is still just, you know, it's Darktide, right? So this is a good increase in sort of these sort of increases, these quality of life increases, this is what Ogren needs more of, is to be able to actually freely move his body, because he feels so jank to play, and that's removing that is a good step in the right direction, even if it's not perfect just yet. Veteran, as they mentioned before the weekend, got a change very akin to what we saw for the Arbites a few months ago, dropping the crack grenade cooldown, or the crack grenade replenishment, from 60 seconds for demolition stockpile to 90 seconds. And the frag and smoke grenades are remaining unchanged at 60 seconds. The reason being here, crack grenades, especially if you have to consider lower difficulties, crack grenades just play the game for you, more or less. Crack grenades find the most high value targets because they stick to those Carapace armored enemies, they stick to shields, and you can adhere them to bosses if you can hit them directly, but they do so much direct damage, and they aren't scaled with your player power or anything, that imagine, imagine you're playing on Heresy for a moment, right, where a lot of players do play. They play on Heresy or Damnation. You only get 1 or 2 bosses in the whole game, and 3 crack grenades from a veteran who has the additional crack grenade damage talent kills the boss. So you basically don't even get to participate against that, and you also get a very small smattering of crushers, who are supposed to be a large threatening enemy, and as we just reduced the crusher amount by 35%, now that always having 3 or even 4 crack grenades on hand means that you just get to effectively snap your fingers and erase these threats, which is effective, right? But it's not fun, and no one really wants to play on a team with a person who can infinitely just remove all the cool big threats that are supposed to be challenging combats. It's cool at first to win the game, but then it becomes unexciting. And I think that also this will push more incentive to play with some of these other grenades, which are still very good, but you know that they were being undervalued because crack grenades were a counter to that crusher threat that was omnipresent. Hive Scum got a similar sort of nerf here. I think these were very well warranted. A -1 to both the chem grenade and the boombringer. You know, the most impactful single-handedly, like no doubt. These are the 2 best grenades in the entire game. The boombringer acting as an Ogren bomb, more or less, with 4 potential charges, now is dropped to 3 if you have extra pouches. Chem grenade dropped to 3 if you have extra pouches, which is a 15-second area denial, which can cover an entire hallway. These are still the best grenades in the game, I would say. And remember that there really aren't any other competitive grenades in the game that are non-replenishable. So the other competitive grenades would be like the shock mine from the Arbites, but he is probably running the ability to replenish it. The veteran has really good grenades, but he can replenish his grenades. So the grenade pack are still going to go to the Hive Scum, because these are still just as powerful as they were. There's just less of them. So you won't be able to pick up a single grenade pack and be like, okay, the next time the game launches 4, the next 4 massive encounters are just going to get wiped off the map entirely, which is another big, like, fuck you, no fun for anybody else sort of thing. Especially if you've ever played, if you played in that event where the grenades replenished every time you, like, it was like 10% of the time where you kill an Ogre or something, you get 20, got all your grenades back, and it was just Hive Scums running rampant, rocketing everything. And so, yeah, like other classes didn't even get to play because the Hive Scum would just run through the map and just rocket everything instantly. So reducing the ability of the Hive Scum to instantly end fights, I think is good because you want to actually fight the fights because that's the fun part of the game. Also, I should mention, by the way, when we're talking about the veteran and his demolition stockpile ability, this is barely going to change the nature of the crack grenade spam. This is going to reduce the number of crack grenades you'll throw in a game by like 10 if you're playing on Havoc 40, when you are probably throwing somewhere on the order of 100 on a normal game, because of course you have a second talent that regenerates crack grenades at a percentage rate, which is insanely broken still and might need to be touched on in the future. All right, now let's get into it. The big elephant in the room, the biggest part of this patch, the one that's probably the hardest to explain, the Uncanny Strike nerf. How impactful is this, and is it going to ruin our lovely Uncanny Strike using weapons? I'll leave that up to you to decide, but I'm going to give you the real like meat and potatoes of what this is going to do. So the previous blessing, rending, of Uncanny Strike, up to 125% rending. This is a massive amount of rending. And what rending does is it adds to your weapon's attack damage modifier. So when we look at a weapon, if we look at, for instance, our heavy attack on the knife here, if we look over here, this is the intended normal 152 damage on a heavy attack, right? So we look over here at our damage types against the armors, and we got 152 here, 152 on Unyielding, and 152 on Maniac. That means these have 1.0 ADM, 100% damage efficacy. Infested and Flak Armor take 10% less, so they have a 90% damage efficacy. And then Carapace Armor is at 92, which is 60% of the 152, so a 60% ADM, 60% damage efficacy. So what that rending does is you just add to that ADM, you add to your damage efficacy. So you would go from, on the first hit, dealing 60%, to the second hit, dealing plus 25% to 85, then you'd go to 110%, and you go to 135%, but everything over 100% is reduced by 3/4. So after 5 total hits, you could add 125% ADM to your starting of 0.6 here, and you'd end up at 185%, but everything over 100 is reduced by 3/4, remember? So you'd end up down at like 120-ish% damage. So effectively though, think about this, you went from a situation where you were dealing 60% damage, and then within the course of 5 attacks, you are now dealing 120% damage. So in the practical terms, this has doubled your damage because this is the base damage that everything else is based off of. So like these are the numbers with no other buffs applied to your character, but all the strength buffs, all the melee damage buffs, all that stuff goes into effect after this. So this baseline damage is hugely important. And the real important thing about rending that I'm not seeing enough people talking about that like is going to be the main thing that's like the nerf about this, is that this is a character buff. Rending applies to you as the character, and so everything that you deal while you are having this buff on your character is amplified by that amount. So all the burns, all the bleeds, etc., that you are dealing to any target in your vicinity while this melee weapon is in your hand, all the soul blaze, which is why we didn't see the soul blaze nerf and why we saw the uncanny nerf instead, all that stuff is amplified because of this rending buff while it's in your hand. And the really impactful thing here is because it is a character-wide buff, you can carry it from enemy to enemy. You can go from one fight to the next and have full efficacy going into the next one. So here's a great example here. If I have my dueling sword, and in the previous patch, right, what I'd be doing is I'd be going up against this crusher here, and I would be hitting him like this. I'd be dealing that sort of damage, 1,500 damage. It actually be more than this because I'd have actually over 100%. But then when I go to the next target, if I hit him within the next 3.5 seconds, I would still have that buff on me. And so I'd go into this guy and I would hit him for 1,500. But now you can see for every new target, you have to start over again. So this is going to still feel roughly the same. 1v1ing for, crushers. You can see we have no problems there, even on the veteran. No problem taking out crushers, pretty dang easy, but going into the next one, you have to start over and ramp up your damage again. So you can't just roll from enemy to enemy, dunking them individually. And I think this is going to be good for the weapon because this weapon, especially like dueling sword, was primarily used just to run around dunking enemies instantaneously with headshots. It also will reduce the efficacy for headshots against for all damage against flak armored here. So like, let's look at the knife. Knife has a pretty similar damage profile to the dueling sword, but I just have this one on this other build. But look at I have no talents, right? So look at the damages here. On my light attacks, the intended damage is 57. So unyielding, it takes a 1.0, but flak armor here is like a 0.6. So what we'll see is that on the first attack to the gunner here, we'll deal 98 on a headshot, but after 2 attacks, when we've got that 40% brittleness stacked up, we'll be doing 162 or something in the neighborhood of it, right? So we'll do, whoops, that's a crit. Oh my god, stop critting. 99. Can I not crit 3 times in a row, please? What this knife is like blessed. What is going on? It has no crit blessings. How am I critting that much? 99, 131, 163. There we go. Okay, so right, that's the damage ramping you'll see. And previously, remember, you would have that 163 damage all the time, right? So you would roll into the next combat immediately hitting these enemies for that much. And it's even more noticeable perhaps on like the dueling sword, where like light attacks are dealing 334 versus the first hit of like 199, right? So we would go in there immediately hitting this guy for 40% of his HP with a light attack, and that just allows you to just kind of like face roll your way through stuff. So now you have to focus on individual targets to get them to die a little bit more, and yeah. But of course, the brittleness does apply for your whole team, so your whole team can focus on these targets. You'll get extra damage against bosses. It'll really help with bossing because brittleness affects bossing. And it will also apply to any bleeds or whatever that you apply on anybody else. So of all the characters that have been hit by this uncanny nerf or uncanny change and the dueling sword nerf, I think that the Zealot has probably survived the best of the dueling sword users here, simply because he has 2 melee abilities that are pretty good at leveling out the difference that you would have there. So Shroud Field and Fury of the Faithful both give you 100% rending, which previously would have been completely overkill because you already had over 100% rending, so this would have only added 25% damage plus that original 25. So this is still gonna make your hits really, really big. So you're gonna have the 100% rending plus the base 50% on something like the dueling sword, and then you're gonna deal 25% extra damage, and you can still stack that 40% brittleness. So if you're going in for a crusher kill, you can do like that, and then hit a big hit like this, or like against bosses, you get your 40% rending, and then you could do a big, 3,600 damage hit. 3,600 damage, not bad, right? Not bad at all for a single charge heavy attack on a short little cooldown like this. I think that's probably a reasonable amount of damage as compared to being able to one-shot crushers like we could a couple of patches ago. So hopefully with that, you can understand what has changed with the Uncanny Strike thing and decide for yourself whether you want to continue using the dueling sword or the knife. I think they will still be fine in like 90% of cases. Plus, with this extra reduction of crushers, we're doing okay. If I had one thing to say about the situation, it would be that I don't think that the dueling sword or Uncanny Strike, in the grand scheme of things right now, is really the source of OP-ness that we are seeing kind of power creep in the game, right? There are tons of things in the game that are very, very powerful, that are absurdly broken, and almost none of them are melee weapons, because melee weapons, you have to actually go and melee the enemies, right? The other things in the game, the abilities and the grenades and the ranged weapons, you can cross-map entire enemy hordes and delete them from existence without engaging them with them martially. And I think that that is probably where they'll have to look if they want to find the sources of like the big OP-ness in the game. And of course, you know me being me, if I see any big OP-ness, I will be all over that. I will call it out. So you can expect to see a juicy video about it. Let's go on to the other things that have happened surrounding this Uncanny Strike nerf. Shivs. Shivs have been reduced down from the rending here of 40% rending to the same thing, but with brittleness here. So this really isn't really going to matter, right? This is just a change in the terminology. I think this leaves shivs at the exact same place, because rending and brittleness function the exact same way. If you have over 100% ADM from brittleness, or if you have over 100% damage from rending, it's going to give you the same damage throughput. So applying that brittleness to the target is going to increase whatever damage that you have from toxins or whatever on them. But remember, again, it's only going to apply to that target. So the same thing applies as before. before, the rolling of your rending buff from one target to the next, that's going to be the really big impactful change here that you're going to feel, because you don't go into the next combat all juiced up and ready to go. Then for other melee rending blessings, we have two other ones, Bladed Momentum and Opportunist. I think I have Bladed Momentum on a heavy sword here somewhere. Well, if I don't, I can look at it in the Masteries section. So Bladed Momentum is on heavy sword, at least. I can't remember what other weapons it's on, but hitting multiple enemies in one sweep gives 8% melee rending for 4 seconds, stacking 5 times. So this previously, of course, rending was a buff applying to the whole character, and that would apply to all sources of damage, so burns, bleeds, etc. They don't want that to be the case. So now this only applies to the melee damage direct itself. Sure, right? I don't think a whole lot of people were going for bleed builds with the heavy sword. Maybe, I guess you with this talent here on the veteran probably okay. The one that is probably a little bit more impactful on would be Opportunist. This would be applicable on the Ogren because Opportunist is on the slab shield. It's on one of the veterans, or not the veterans, the Arbites shields. So like the Ogren could apply batter, and then that 25% rending would help you to bleed out crushers and stuff like that. Sure. I think that probably that doesn't really matter so much because Skull Crusher still being as insane as it is. But yeah, that's kind of where we're at. They seem to be wanting to reduce the efficacy of damage over time effects. You know, being carried, being amplified by all these other things, which I think is a good place to start because damage over time effects are a very, very scary principle. They're a very scary thing in Darktide because they can do a lot while you do very little actively. Okay, so what happened here? All this stuff with the Uncanny Strike changes. The Sapper Shovel was adversely affected by this because the Sapper Shovel had Uncanny Strike that was kind of keeping it relevant. They've given it a nice buff between 10 and 20% across all of its damage modifiers to compensate for this, made it actually deal some damage into Carapace without needing Uncanny Strike. And of course, now it can apply Brittleness, which is still pretty good too. The other thing I neglected to mention was that the Chem Toxin damage over time got reduced quite heftily. Definitely warranted. Chem Toxin is insanely powerful. If you're wondering how this works, you know, when they're saying max stacks, Chem Toxin is the only linear dot in the game. So let's demonstrate here. When I have a Chaos Spawn, 6 stacks does 100, 12 stacks does 200, right, and so forth. So yeah, we are capping out now with the stats that I have here. I believe I have 25% damage versus unyielding here, and I think, oh no, I don't have it here. So let's actually, we can even go further if we go for like this in-your-face buff here. So now, if I have this and I stack all the way up to 30 stacks, this is what we're looking like for damage, right? That's still a lot of fucking damage. dealing 700 damage, what is that, 2 or 3 times a second? I don't even know. That is a crazy, crazy DPS rate. So this is after those nerfs, right? That is insane. So yeah, this being reduced by 1/4 and still being where it is absurd. So dots in general are a very scary thing in Darktide because they can deal a fuck ton of damage while you effectively don't have to do very much. And so if they're trying to push us back to a place where we have to think about our engagements and actually fight each enemy directly, I kind of like that. In order to compensate for the change there, the Shiv's got a little bit of a buff technically to its weapon special, the throwing knife. They boosted the base damage of it quite considerably and the headshot damage a lot. This is going to mean that you can actually one-shot the same target you could before, because previously 3 stacks of toxin for the throwing knife, which it also applied in addition to the direct damage, was killing certain targets, was hitting breakpoints. And if you take that away from it and you have to throw 2 knives to kill the same thing, it's kind of shit. So they didn't want to nerf it like that. So they made it so that if you can hit the target, you'll still kill it with this extra damage. And if you can get a headshot, you'll do a lot of damage. So that's a nice change, you know, encourages skills. They did also nerf the Mark 1, which is the dominant, like the vastly dominant ski poles version of the Shiv, just slightly. As I pointed out previously, the the Mark 1 here, when we're talking about its damage ratios, we are talking about a damage ratio that's on the order of like 5 to 6 times, right? So they've changed the Carapace armor slightly down, and the finesse boost, meaning this is the boost you get from getting crits, this has gone slightly down, but this really won't impact this weapon because it is just still so powerful. Okay, so now let's go on to the damage over time from the Inferno Force staff, and I'll talk about my feelings here. This is them sort of testing the waters. I've seen their responses on the forums about this. They are not yet ready to pull the trigger on this, but effectively what you should understand is that this change right here, direct hit ADM versus Carapace armor from 0.25 to 0.35, this is almost nothing. So people were saying, like, oh my gosh, they gave it such a big buff. Let's just demonstrate this in real time. Oh, by the way, if you're wondering, you know, how I'm just like swapping between these characters and going straight to the meat grinder, this is a mod called the Psych Ward, and it's really good, so you should go get it, or you should get my mod pack, because it's in there. Okay, so like that's this damage, right? So realistically, these targets don't die to the Flame Staff, right? This is not, like, Flame Staff doesn't kill Crushers. Even with Venting Shriek here at 21 extra stacks, we're dealing 69 nice damage to this guy. And this guy has 6,500 HP, and this is on Damnation. So this guy is not dying to Soul Blaze. So this buff here, this change here is nothing, is literally nothing. It's not going to matter at all. The same thing, the Soul Blaze stacks themselves almost tripled in damage, but as you can see there, the triple in damage, those ticks were doing fuck all to that thing, literally dealing 1% of his HP per tick. That doesn't matter. That is going to have zero effect, and you cannot now, you know, cheese it with the rending on the sword. Now, is this to say that this weapon should be nerfed further? No, of course not, because if we're going to remove Crushers from the game, the one enemy that kind of does counter the Flame Staff, well then all the rest of the enemies are going to be the enemies that are countered by the Flame Staff, and it will resume having its dominance that it does, where it just kind of runs roughshod over the entire game by lighting everything on fire. The one that I am a little bit happier for is the Burn ADM. This is going to help the Ogun's like light 'em up stuff. It's also going to help the Recon Lasgun, which I love a lot, but there's not really that many sources of burn in the game. Flamethrower, I guess, as well, versus Carapace armor. It's going to double the damage, but again, it's going from 0.1 to 0.2, so it's effectively nothing. So these changes here are almost none, and this change is like, what 0.2? I don't even know what that would be. What's 255 divided by 250? 255 divided by, wait. 255 divided by 250. Yeah, 2%. That's a 2% increase. So yeah, that's a 2% increase at max stacks of Soul Blaze. It doesn't need this. I don't know why they thought that was necessary at all. But yeah, this is going to have zero impact. The thing that's going to have an impact on the Inferno Force stuff here is that there's not going to be any of these Crushers to be worried about. And of course, you can't choose it. Okay, so that's all the showcasing and stuff wrapped up. Let's talk about the other features and tweaks and stuff. We have added some automatic file integrity checks to launchers after crashes caused by corrupt game files. Interesting. Okay. I don't think I was having that happen, but hopefully it doesn't force me to repair too much. Reduce the time of expedition captures and objectives. That'll be really nice, because I think the only reason anyone's doing this anymore is to farm for their currencies, so you can get those done a little bit quicker. You can equip some stuff on Veteran and Zealot, and then some fixes. Inventory crash when transitioning into a mission loaders. Oh, that happened to me, so I'm glad they fixed that. They could have voice chat information showing up with your team HUD panel visible. The Veteran Survivalist aura was not going to cool when other players killed an enemy. Dang it, they figured that out. So yeah, previously the Veteran Survivalist, you know, getting 1% of your ammo back every 5 seconds. The other players killing elites and specials and stuff was giving you the 1% back, but not putting it on cooldown. So if the Veteran just didn't kill any elites or specials, you would just get infinite ammo pretty much. And then we are getting a HUD icon for Desperation. We're getting some fixes to where things are below the ground. People are dying at the exit of the Sanctuary. That cropped up in the last patch. You can now finally ping the things in the Sanctuary, as they've been posting about like a million times. And yeah, okay, all right. So yeah, that's the overview, guys. As I said at the beginning, hopefully this is just one in many steps in the right direction. I'll make some videos in the days and weeks to come about what I think should be the next steps to get this thing all in line. Just a nuclear disarmament of both enemies and players alike, and return us to a more stable and understandable game state where it's not just like unga bunga billion nuclear bombs going off every 5 seconds. And I'll see you then. Well, thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time. Mystery out. Bye bye.